Hello again, this is Grant Swartzwelder with OTA Environmental Solutions, and welcome to another episode of Oilfield Strong. We are fortunate today to have Jason Schumacher, partner with O'Melveny law firm, big law firm in Dallas and national that focuses on energy. Jason's a partner, head of their energy group, been a friend for ages, very smart guy. And today we're going to be talking about something that I think on the first glance you don't think about, but it really affects the economics for an oil company for producing well, and that has to do with midstream commercial accounts and all the different issues coming with how to get your commodity to market. And so it seems like with all the consolidation of midstream companies, issues with takeaway, volumetrics, or just how much room in a pipe there is, that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Is that how you see it, Jason?
I do, yeah. And Grant, thanks again for having me. Really glad to talk to your audience and really glad for our friendship. Happy to be on with you to talk about this. So, from my vantage point, probably over the last 5 years, I think, midstream contracts were quite frankly a little bit sleepy in terms of how much attention that upstream companies gave to them, just to be real honest with you. The midstream company would send over their contract, the upstream company would flip it. They would be told that, there was kind of a take it or leave it, and this is the best I can do for you, and the upstream company would sign it and put it on the shelf, and then everybody would kind of hope, quite frankly, you'd never have to look at it. And so the reality is that now midstream contracts are getting a lot more scrutiny, and I think that's for the following reasons. So one is that it is intense when you're drilling in an area where there's limited pipeline capacity to make sure that you get firm service on those lines, and that if somebody doesn't take your gas or doesn't take your crude or doesn't take the nasty water that comes out of the ground and deposit in a hole for you, that you have some alternatives and you have some remedies against companies that do that. Because quite frankly, most midstream contracts are drafted in a way where the midstream company has their cake and eat it too a lot of times, in the sense that they'll have dedications of production or dedications of disposed water, and sometimes limited obligations to actually take it on a firm service basis. And so the devil can definitely be in the details of those contracts related to the rights that the and obligations the midstream company has to the upstream company. And so, for better for worse, whenever pipelines get squeezed for capacity, you definitely want, if you're an upstream company, you definitely want to have a contract that puts you first in line over the other customers to actually get that capacity that you thought you're getting. And as you can imagine, for midstream companies, they're wanting the most flexibility because they have issues, which is downstream. They could suddenly get shut off, and then that shut off then affects them and what
All
it
the way
is they're
back.
doing, right? And so it's a very interesting world right now in terms of, how those contracts are being drafted. And then in particular, as you're fighting for capacity, you'll see upstream companies committing to minimum volume commitments in order to get their hydrocarbons or their water online in front of somebody else and get a higher level of service than other people. And that part has been really interesting, because once you have minimum volume commitments, right, then suddenly this midstream contract is really starting to look and feel a little bit like a financing wrapped inside of receipt points and delivery points and quality specs. Because the thing that's going on is that the midstream company is committing dollars to that upstream company, while trying to figure out how they're going to get those dollars repaid with the capital they're going to spend. And they're doing that through MVCs and service rates. Really, really interesting how complex some of these things are getting in terms of how the MVCs can go up and down, how the firm's service capacity can go up and down, how the releases of dedication can occur, and even into drilling incentives where midstream companies are paying upstream companies to drill and get volume. So a really dynamic area right now, I think, in the oil and gas space and in the contracting space.
Well, in that MVC that you're talking about, in a way, you're kind of committing a certain, as the name implies, a certain volume.
Yep.
And but how do you determine that? You're drilling. Well, if you've got an existing area, but you probably don't. You already have the pipeline if that's the case. So you're drilling in an area, you don't know exactly what your volumes are. So how do you go about that? Because I would
Yeah.
assume that the upstream company or the midstream company would have some penalties for you if you don't meet those volumes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the way it works, right? It's kind of like a note, if you will. So your MVC, basically you take the minimum volume commitment for a year, you multiply that times the service rate, and that's how much money you owe at the end of the term, right? At the end of each year. And so the way these MVCs get drafted, right? And again, these midstream contracts have some of the most intense modeling that you will see in terms of revenues coming in and expenses going out. They can really, really get intense. Just, the Excel spreadsheets that are used to model these things out are
Sure.
amazing. And so the MVC, the way it's determined, right, is normally you set the MVC at some percentage of your production in that target project area, the dedicated area. And then it's not unusual, though, for the midstream company to expect more volumes, right, in order to give you the capacity that you're looking for. And so they might ramp that MVC up based on what the upstream company is telling them about what their drill schedule is going to be, right? And so those MVCs may go up year over year for some period of time and then may go down as capital is deployed and production decline happens. And where those numbers land, I mean, it is a very interesting math problem, Grant, that these
Yeah.
companies are figuring out together in terms of where that's going to land. And obviously, if you're the upstream company, you would never sign yourself up to that unless you feel really certain that the capital is going to be there your for you to drill, right? And that you're actually going to do it. But unfortunately, for better or for worse, we've had upstream companies that have signed up for those MVCs. The winds have changed, right, for whatever reason, and they end up writing checks to the midstream company at the end of the year because they didn't meet their minimum volume commitments. And so, as you can imagine, that's a frustrating check to write.
Yeah.
You're the upstream company.
Now, but what happens if you go above that? Are you able to like bank these
Yeah,
volumes for later on so that you kind of net it all out, or is
yeah,
it kind of you lose it
yeah.
if not?
And that's where the really savvy negotiating should happen, right? So if you're an oil and gas company that's agreed to a minimum volume commitment and you exceed it, right, then what you want is you want to bank those volumes, okay?
Right.
And so, I sent you 20% more than what my MVC was. I want to bank those. And so if I end up being 20% down the next year, I want to deploy that as credit. So that way I don't have to write a check. And as you can imagine, the midstream company doesn't want to agree to that, right? So they don't want you to be able to bank it. They just want to take that as gravy and then let's go year over year separate. And so those negotiations are happening too, related to those banked volumes. Yeah, great question.
Well, and then another term I hear is talk about reserve capacity,
Yeah,
and in a way that seems to kind of be linked to that minimum volume, and that you kind of are sitting. If I understand it, and please correct me, you're kind of sitting a certain amount of volume at the beginning, and explain
yeah.
that to me if you would.
Yeah, and so that's one of the negotiations that happens, right? So in any midstream negotiation, right, for firm service, the upstream company wants as much capacity as they can get, and the midstream company wants to give as little as they can get because they're trying to get as many customers, right?
Right.
And so in order to get as much reserve capacity on a line, so the midstream company said, well, I can give it to you so long as you guarantee me money, and so I'm gonna require your MVCs. And so sometimes there's actually a relationship between the amount of the MVCs and the reserve capacity, where sometimes the reserve capacity is X and the MVC is half of X, right? And you'll see that be throughout, let's say it's an 8 year contract, you'll see that spread out over the 8 years, where reserve capacity is one number and the MVC is half, or the MVC is 75%. And so they actually have a direct correlation with each other in the contract. In order for the midstream company to reserve that volume. And then the other thing that goes on with reserve capacities, though, is if I'm an upstream company, I negotiated for a high reserve capacity, but then I don't deliver the volumes. Well, then the midstream company's like, hey, I could have sold that capacity to somebody else. You didn't deliver the volumes that you said you were. I'm going to actually ratchet down your reserve capacity because you missed the target, and I can now sell your capacity to one of your competitors in that same project area. And so you see the MVCs being set, and then you see the reserve capacities ratcheting up and down because the upstream company will also say, well, look, if I exceed my reserve capacity, then I want that thing to ratchet up the next year. right? And the midstream company, of course, doesn't want that to happen. They want to have as much flexibility. And so the negotiations can be really intense around MVCs and reserve capacity.
So what you just determine early on when you're trying to get that pipe can really determine how you can grow and whether you can grow and whether you'll have room for your gas or your oil as you drill more wells. So,
That's exactly right.
so in a way that also fits with the other point that I keep hearing is connecting of new wells, new points. And, so you're kind of committed to this midstream because they've got the, the,
Yep.
the pipe there,
Yep.
but who's going to pay to hook this up? Who's going to add the additional pipe? How does that all get worked out?
Yeah. And so, whenever you're in a dedicated contract, right, I think probably I would call it maybe 10 years ago, most of the time the midstream company, when there was a dedication, the midstream company would build out to the upstream company, right? So the upstream company
Right,
drills well, the midstream company is a service provider, right? And so they would deliver that service, they deliver that pipeline and take that, and that would all be worked inside their economics. Well, that works well unless the rate starts getting competitive. So if the upstream company starts pushing back against the rate, right, then the midstream company says, fine, I can give you a lower rate, but I can't afford the capital to build out to you. And so if you want that lower rate, then you can build out to me, right? And I don't have that capital, but I'll give you capacity on my line, right? And we're seeing a lot more of that where upstream companies really want that steady rate for a long period of time for their economics. And so if it costs them, 100,000, 200,000, $1 million, right, to build that pipeline, that investment is looking a lot easier to make whenever you're building and drilling and fracking a $10 million well, right? It's just like, well, that's just the cost of doing business, right? And
right.
so you're seeing more upstream companies willing to spend that capex in order to have a locked in gathering fee or processing fee, disposal fee, whatever we're talking about, to have that lower for a longer period of time. But that really has changed a lot where you see upstream companies building in large budgets to build out their own pipelines to connect to their midstream counterparts. Really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. It's well, another thing you used to see, well, and I guess it's all supply demand that you used to be able to see midstream companies helping you with promoting drilling more wells,
Yep.
providing more commodity. You still see that, or based on what you
Yeah.
just said, maybe not as much capital out there to do something like that.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, right? In the world of Permian pipelines, right? The pipeline companies at this point have it's a good time to be a pipeline company in the sense that all you're doing, right, is you're going to sell capacity for your line. You're going to build that, and once you've actually have it sold, then in lots of ways you're not really caring about what else happens, right? You've got a number of wells that are hooked up to it. It's going to
Right,
continue. The only thing you're evaluating as a midstream company, does it make sense for me to expand capacity on this line or not? And once you get to a place where you're not going to do that, then you really start losing the incentive, right, to do more build outs because you've got this thing making money at a good rate of return, right? And so now the flip side is that there are projects, right? Greenfield, I'm going to build the processing plant, I'm going to build the gathering system that isn't there, and I need as much volume as I can get as soon as I can get it. And then you're seeing midstream companies in those cases, right, actually maybe do drilling incentives back to the upstream company in order to start getting that volume up so that they can underwrite, sometimes the 100, 200, $500 million it takes to do one of those types of greenfield projects. And that gets really interesting in the deal making where I'm not only, I'm getting a gathering fee, I'm locking in a gathering fee from a good upstream company, but I'm actually paying them in some ways to drill those wells in order for me to get those volumes. And so you have that calculation going inside of your MVC calculation, your reserve capacity calculation. Again, it becomes much more like a financing wrapped around some receipt
hmm.
points and delivery points and quality specs. Really interesting stuff.
So you've got to be really aware of what that midstream system that you're going into, what their volumes are, what is happening around,
Absolutely.
and what
Yep.
additional volumes are coming in. I know we've had some clients down in South Texas that have really been pinched because all of a sudden there's a lot of drilling down the line, and now
Yep.
all of a sudden they're being pushed out.
Yep.
or at the very least, the pressures have gone way up, so they're having to put more compressor in to even
Yep.
be able to access that, and that costs money. And
Yep.
in this case, it's all on them to do. So it's
Yep.
but I guess the moral of all this story is that it's becoming, like everything else in this world, much more complicated. You need to have people like yourself to kind of work with you to kind of negotiate these points, because it sounds like there's a lot of potential, but also a lot of downside if you're not careful.
Yeah, that's right. And and I'm fortunate enough, I get to represent some wonderful midstream clients, and then I represent a lot of upstream clients dealing with their midstream counterparts. And
Yep.
and through that, I've had a chance to kind of see, what's the typical forms of those kinds of contracts right now, and what's advantageous to the midstream company, what's advantageous to the upstream company, and really trying to find some solutions for both parties to get what they're trying to get once that term sheet is actually signed. And so, being on both sides of that gives me a really unique perspective, but I can typically help them find solutions quickly because, it looks like the negotiation that I did 2 days ago, right? And
Right.
that's where I think I bring a lot of value. But if you don't have that, really strong commercial person advising you about how these things work, and if you don't have a good lawyer behind you, you can sign one of these midstream contracts that's 10 years fully dedicated. They're not taking your gas, they're not taking your oil, they're not taking your water, but there's not much you can do about it. It's a really, really powerless situation. And unfortunately, we've come across clients that have found themselves in that situation, calling us after the fact, trying to figure out what to do. And so it would be much better if they called me before to
Yeah.
say,
This kills the whole economics of the whole
yep,
project very
yep.
quickly. So Jason Schumacher, really appreciate your time. If anyone's interested in finding out more, I bet you're welcome to take their email or their call. O'Melveny is in Dallas. You're in Dallas, but they're
Yeah,
national.
so yep. So I'm in Dallas. So Melvany has offices across the world, but we have three offices in Texas, in Dallas, Houston, and in Austin. We've got a fully dedicated Texas energy team to go with energy lawyers across the world. And yeah, we represent people in all different shapes and sizes in the energy space. But my practice in particular is upstream companies, midstream companies, and what those two companies do every day. Yeah, I'd be very happy to answer any questions anybody has about midstream contracts, and very happy to help anybody out with that.
Well, Jason, you got a great reputation, so I think people would be well do well to give you a call. So thank you for your time.
No, thank you so much for having me on, Grant. Really appreciate it.